So the English colonies continue to grow despite many challenges. Today, we're going to look at how colonial government was influenced by political changes in England and how this led to ideas of political equality among the colonists. Each colony was led by a governor who served as the head of the colony's government. Sometimes the governor was chosen by the king, sometimes he was picked by the people who owned the company that started the colony, and other times he was elected by the people of the colony. These governors were assisted by an advisory council. Now, if you were lucky, you lived in a colony where people also elected representatives to help make laws. But even if you had representatives, anything passed had to be agreed upon by the governor and his advisory council, and they got final say if something would happen or not. Jamestown gave us the first colonial legislature in America. At first, it was a single body, but later it split into two houses. What's called a bicameral legislature, two-house legislature. One house was selected by the Virginia Company. Remember, that's the company that started the Jamestown colony. So one house was selected by the Virginia Company and the governor, but the second house was selected by the colonists. So the members of the second house, and this was called the House of Burgesses, those members were selected by the colonists in Virginia. It's very significant because this is how it helped establish a representative form of government in colonial America. From early on, people had a say in who governed over them and how the laws were made. In New England, the center of politics was the town meeting. This is where people talked about and decided on issues of local interest, such as paying for schools and things like that. This was possible because people in New England lived relatively close together. In the South, however, colonists lived farther apart, so coming together frequently for a town meeting wasn't really realistic. Here in the South, decisions were made at the county level, which is a much bigger geographic area. And the middle colonies were a mix, with some places having people living near one another so they could have town meetings, and other places in the middle colonies, people were spread out, so they had to do things like county meetings in order to make laws. The colonial courts made up another important part of the colonial legislature. These courts generally made rulings that reflected local beliefs. Like, for example, in Massachusetts, many of the laws in Massachusetts enforced the Puritans' religious beliefs. We also see these courts upholding some individual liberties. One important case involved a printer named John Peter Zenger, who printed some things about the governor that the governor did not like. Under a monarchy, no one would ever dare print bad things about their king, but things were different in the colonies, and Zenger's attorney argued that what he printed was true, even though the governor said it wasn't, but even more so, that his client had a right to free speech. That free speech was a basic right of people. The jury members decided that the colonists did have a right to voice their ideas openly, and they found Zenger not guilty, and the Zenger trial was important in establishing the right of the freedom of the press in the colonies. But keep in mind, even with these governors and the colonists electing representatives, even with town meetings in New England, the English monarch still had authority over the colonies. In the 1680s, we began to see a lot of political change. In 1685, James II becomes King of England, and he is determined to get more control over the colonies, believing that they are too independent. He united the northern colonies under one government called the Dominion of New England. And he picks this guy, Sir Edmund Andros, as governor. And the colonists didn't like any of this. One of the big reasons was that Andros limited the power of these town meetings that they were having in New England, which these town meetings had become sort of the political way of life in the North. And so he limits the power of those, not something that the colonists really enjoyed seeing. Fortunately, King James II doesn't last too long, and Parliament passes the English Bill of Rights in 1689. So the English Bill of Rights gave the English people certain rights, such as freedom of speech, but it also promoted democratic ideas, and it really charged up the colonists to value their own right to elect representatives to decide local issues. Following this, the colonies and the Dominion formed new assemblies and a charter and could elect their own representatives. This idea of local representation and local decision-making is taking strong root in the American value system. Then we have the Enlightenment, this movement that began in Europe in the 1750s that ended up having a strong influence on the colonists. It spread the idea that knowledge and reason and science could improve society. Ideas spread through experiments, through lectures, through organizations throughout Europe and eventually throughout the colonies. And this led colonists to begin seeing government's role very differently. They began believing that people had natural rights, such as equality and liberty, and that government could not take these rights away. The Enlightenment influenced colonial leaders, how the colonists organized their governments, and ultimately gave way to many of the freedoms that we have today. The return of religious values in the 1720s through the 1740s led to something called the Great Awakening. Influential preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield inspired the colonists in New England and in the middle colonies to re-examine their faith, their relationship with one another, even their education. As the Great Awakening spread, people flocked to revivals to hear sermons. They also spent time talking about political and social issues as well. And as people heard more and more sermons about spiritual equality of all people, they began realizing political equality was an important aspect of life and began demanding more political equality for all citizens. As ideas continued to blossom thanks to the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, and as the political climate changed in Europe, colonists began seeing themselves as having more and more rights. We will see how this unfolds as these presumed rights are threatened and even taken away in the coming years.